major challenges that confronts us and how we can deal with those. Then we'll take a look at the opportunities that are there, given those hindrances, given those limitations. What are the essential growth opportunities that we have and the way forward? And then we'll have a conclusion. All right. So let's begin with the first graph. And from this graph, from this graph, you will see exactly what I'm talking about. Okay? This, in fact, shows the growth. This, in fact, shows the growth from 1980, that's the period 1980. So what I've done, I've broken them up into basically average growth for the 5-year periods. So that's 1980 to 1984. That's the first 5 years. And 5-year increments, all right, coming down to 2024. Okay? Now, we are using our real GDP growth in Dominica between 1980 and 2024. Now, why real GDP growth? Real GDP growth is considered to be the international standard by which we measure a country's development. Okay, so that is used in practically every country. There is a way it is done. We are going to go into its calculation, but we are going to be using these are the numbers that I have obtained from the International Monetary Fund. These are numbers that are given by the country authorities to the IMF, and they have made a huge database that all of this information is kept in. And so that's what we are using, is real growth. In other words, when you have a country growing by X% a year, that's what we are talking about. Okay? So we are going to go back to the very first period there. And if you notice, that is 7%. Okay? So between 80 and 84, Dominica's economy grew by 7% real GDP. And let me just say, this is the kind of growth that you need to really, a country like ours, its size and so on, that's the kind of growth you really need to get the country out of poverty. For example, in the 1930s, 40s, China was a very poor, if you like, backward country. But between the 1980s and 1990s, they were able to get their growth rates. So for many years, China was growing by like 15-20% a year. And that is how they will remove millions and millions of people out of poverty. So now that China is even trying to rival the United States in terms of prosperity and so on. But it's because they're able to generate a significant amount of economic growth over that period that allowed them to achieve that. So we have, but for us, 7% would really do very well for us. Okay? So that's where we are at 7% that we were in 1980-84. Then see what happened. We began to see a decline in 85, 89. Okay? So we moved from basically 7% growth to roughly basically 4%. Right? So that's a roughly 4% growth there. And then 1990 we moved down to as low as 2%. 2% growth. So within basically 10 years, we moved down 5 percentage points of GDP. And we have never really recovered from that since that period. Then between 1994, there was some upward movement back to around 3%, 1995, 99. And then we moved in that period there, 2000. So that period there, the 1995-1999 period, that was when the People's Party was in government. So we basically maintained a rate of growth of about 2.5% during that 5-year period. And then we basically moved below 2% in 2000, when the Labour Party took over in 2000. We moved to be just slightly below 2%. Then in 2005-2009, it was pushed back up to 3%, but then from 2009, we began to see a very significant sign in economic activity in Dominica. So we moved from around 3% in 2005-2009 to roughly 1%. in 2010-14, and it kind of remained that way for. So we had basically, if you like, 10 years of really less than 1% growth.
What?
Okay, 10 consecutive years of less than 1% growth in Dominica, and we've seen a little uptick there, and some of that uptick we see to above 1% is just because of the growth, the high growth we saw after Hurricane Maria in 2017. Then things, usually we have a very big tip or drop, then the following years are much more elevated. So that is some of what we see here. But you can see that we moved from all the way from 7% in 1980 to this 1%. So that comes. So when you think of the issues that Dominica is facing, you can look at this graph. Remember this graph. That is where we are. And that forms the basis of a lot of the issues that we have in Dominica. Youth unemployment, high migration rates, or social problems that we have. We can trace it to this very significant decline in economic growth that we've seen. So in terms of setting the basis, in terms of understanding this, our challenge then is how do we get this uptick? How do we move this line from here to back here? So that becomes the real challenge for us at Dominica. Okay? So I'm going to leave some students a little while longer, take a very close look at this graph. And especially as the people are just coming in, I'm going to make sure they see this, because if you miss this graph, the rest of the presentation is not as coherent. Right? So that's a very important thing to understand in terms of where we are with the rates of the economic growth. Okay? So let's move on to the next slide. Alright, so take it as well, take a look at our neighbors. And the way I've done it is to make it as uncomplicated as possible. So we have Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, and Dominica. And then we have two periods. So this I'm not very good at this lime green color is really the rate of growth between 1980 and 1999. So we look at 20 years between 1980 and 1999, and then we looked at the years from 2000 to 2024. So that is this thing there. All right, that's 2020. So you're comparing this with this, with this, with this between 2000 and 2024. So, and then you're comparing the lines, okay, between 1980 and 1999. So let's look at the lime green one first. Let's look at this first. So during that period, the country that performed the best between the period between 1980 and 1999 would be St. Lucia. So St. Lucia recorded growth of about 5% during that time. So that's an average growth. Means that's some years would be above 5%, some years would be below 5%, but on average, they had a 5% growth in St. Lucia. Dominica was first, but Grenada was basically second, with about 4.5% rate of growth during that 20-year period. So you see, St. Lucia is first, Grenada is second, and Dominica was at roughly 4%, number 3, and then St. Vincent was slightly behind us at around 3.8%. Okay? So that was for the 1980 to 1999. So Dominica was doing relatively well. But then something happened, because if you look at this, all of this growth has disappeared since 2000 for all the countries. So what could give is not just Dominica, but it's something that something's happening to the other islands as well. Because here between 2000, you see now, Dominica now we moved from third place to basically last now since 2000. We have the highest Grenada. There's nothing to write home about because they're now only at around just about about 2.4% on average. Okay? So Grenada about 2.4%. St. Vincent closely behind, just about 2.1%. St. Lucia 1.8%, and Dominica about 1.5%. Okay, so we have had like a very drastic shift in the economic fortunes of those islands, including Dominica. But Dominica is St. Lucia probably has the most profound dip in growth because they moved from well over 5% to about 1.5%. Dominica moved from basically from 4% to 1.3, 1.4%. Okay, so that is where we are operating now, and that's where the problem continues to be because most of the low growth we're seeing is in the more recent years. And that's why when we think of the challenge, how we correct it, then we have to look at what was happening during that period and how we can change that dynamic to allow us to be able to express and to register a much higher rate of economic growth. Okay.
Question now?
Yes, sure. We can take questions as we go along. Yes.
Okay. The Fontaine days were interesting in that between 2000 and 2024, there is significant downturn in the economy of the United Islands. You did not state what likely to be responsible for that, but would you say?
Yeah, we are coming. I was just kind of laying on for it, and then I'll go into the analysis.
Okay, but I just wanted to ask, as you think, does it have to do with any change in the banana industry?
Okay, we'll come to that discussion. Yeah. So during that discussion, so I was trying to lay out the history and then we go into the factors that impact it. Yeah. All right. So we can move to the next slide. All right. So this slide now again. This is just, I'm sorry about the quality of this. Then it's just a matter of showing the different year periods. All right. So again, Dominica is in the lime green. Again, going back to 1980, Dominica is in the lime green. So again, I packed it in a 5-year period. And so we're comparing the 4 countries between 1980 and 1984. So in the first 5 years, if you notice, the lime green is a star there. Dominica is doing really well in 1980 compared to the other islands because we are well at 7% growth, and none of the other islands matched it between 1980 and 1984. So Dominica is doing very well here. That's Dominica right here. Grenada is next in line with just about almost 6%, about 5.8%. And then followed by the purple is St. Lucia and then St. Vincent. All right. So you see how that first 5 years. Now look at what's beginning to happen already there between 1985 and 1989. Dominica has moved from its first position already to the 4th position during that year. So the purple St. Lucia, that was St. Lucia's brightest moments there. You see that tower there. Over 11%, about 11% growth during that 5-year period for St. Lucia, followed by Grenada with about almost 6%, and then we have St. Vincent and then Dominica. So we begin to see that reversal. Then the other period, 1990 to 94 period here, again you begin to see now all the countries are beginning to contract, right? Because already this is significantly less than this year. So already the countries are beginning to contract here. And Dominica, again, just keep your eyes on the line doing for Dominica. We moved from about 4.5% in that period to just over 2% in that period there. All right? And you can trace Dominica going forward 1995 to 1999. We're here. And then look at this. I want to take us there. We're kind of exchanging positions during that period. But I want to take us here, and you see, how Dominica begins to show up against Grenada. It is doing relatively well in that period. Grenada again is doing relatively well. Dominica is right there, and here, slight improvement, but nothing much in the last 5 years. Okay, so that is how we compare with our neighbors. We can move forward now. So let's look at the economic challenges. And so when we begin to talk about this, we begin to talk about some of the reasons why we have had this huge decline in our economy. Part of the issue that we have for all of the islands as well is this dependence on a single industry. So for many, many years for Dominica, it was that dependence on agriculture, on the agriculture sector, and more particularly bananas, that drove our economic survival. For some of the other islands, it was tourism. But you'll notice that during that period in Dominica's history, the focus was on bananas. That was doing really well for us until when bananas started to go out, then the country fortunes began to go down as well. Another huge challenge that we saw during that time, I haven't survived, I don't want to spend too much time on the debt issue, but debt has been another big problem for us. Because what happened, as the single industry started to decline, then governments found that they needed to borrow a lot more to meet their obligations. So income that they would normally get through taxation, they now have to borrow to maintain some level of spending. So over that period, we accumulated quite a high level of debt, in particular external debt, and sometimes borrowing directly from the domestic banking sector. So that has been a very serious challenge. The first one, of course, we have social challenges. That shift that you saw, if you look at this, at the crime statistics, for example, in a country like St. Lucia, a lot of the issues, and in St. Vincent, a lot of the issues started with that huge decline. And that's the reason why, for us, in Dominica, we need to be extremely careful. Because St. Vincent had, I believe, close to 80-something murders last year. Just to our south, St. Lucia had an ongoing issue with murders and so on. You can see it creeping in Dominica. Right? And we need to be careful, because if you're not careful, we'll go the same way as St. Lucia and St. Vincent as far as crime is concerned. I think to some extent they have done better than the other countries with regards to our control of crime, but it's something that can really impact us. And then there's the issue of climate change issue, and in particular for us, the hurricane. It's something that we face every year, and we've had it in 2015, in 2017, we had this major hurricane that always poses a huge problem. That always poses a huge problem for us. Okay. Exchange rate issue, that's a very important issue for us in Dominica, because what you'll notice that we have been since 1970s, Dominica's currency has been pegged and fixed to the US dollar at 2.7 to the US dollar, and that has served us for a very long time. All right. Low savings rate. Because we don't have a lot of income, you find that people don't save as much. And why is that important? Savings usually determine the level of investments. Because the more savings within the banking system, the more the banks have to give out for loans and so on. And you can have investment for businesses and all the rest of it. And high interest rates, that's one thing you'll notice in Dominica, where the interest rates have been extremely prohibitive. For small businesses, for example, it's very difficult to go and borrow at commercial rates to try to run a business. And that's why when you're thinking of how to tackle some of the issues you're having, if you want to improve on the idea of to have more businesses, to have more private sector activity, then you must think of how you can allow access to capital for businesses. Okay? So a responsible government, for example, must have some system. We tried with the aid bank, but the aid bank never quite fulfilled what it was intended to. The aid bank's role was not doing mortgages. Right? The aid bank's role was to help businesses, tourism, and agriculture, and so on, make it possible. But not necessarily to give loans for them to go overseas to study. That was never what the aid bank was able to do. It was supposed to be able to provide very, very low interest rate loans to businesses to make capital available. Because businesses really cannot survive if they are to be taking stuff from the all the time. Right? You can just script it out. All right. So that is that's the issue. You can read off the. All right. Okay. Just a little glitch that showed up. You can get rid of it. Okay. Let's see if I can. Let me get this out. I think it's possible I'm going this from the name. All right, let's see this. I think we're back. We just have to go ahead. I'm not sure why. Alright, so let's look at the growth opportunities and the way forward. All right. So we have kind of looked at the major issues, the major problems: high debt levels, climate issues, dependency. I think the dependency one is a very important one. So in terms of thinking through some of the solutions, you have to think of how we can combat those challenges that we spoke about. So, for example, when we move from agriculture, more recently we have moved into the CBI program. Again, with CBI, it is just that. All right, that's a major government revenue source and the country source. So, again, that dependence on one thing, all right, and that has its own issues. So then, how can we move away from that dependency? How can we begin to get this uptick on the slide that we had at the beginning, back to positive growth? Then diversification must be considered. Okay, so we talk about diversification in the context, and you'll hear later in the presentations from agriculture. We have to see how music and entertainment industries can help us in that regard, our renewable energies, our natural environment, how we can make use of all of the resources that we know are within this country to help us to improve on that diversification process. So that's diversification. Then debt, right? This issue of debt is very important. The government currently, for every dollar of income this country earns, it spends at least 32 cents on the repayment of debt. Okay? So that is extremely high. For every dollar, 32 cents goes back to repaying debt. And typically you repay the debt first, even before you do anything else. And the reason for that is if you don't repay that debt, then you don't have access to new borrowing. So if you want to keep the avenues of borrowing open, you have to keep paying the debt. So that's an obligation that you have every single month, because most amortizations are monthly. So you have to repay those loans basically monthly. So already if you're spending so much in debt repayment, then you have to think about how you can get that level of debt to reduce. For example, from 32 cents on the dollar, probably to like 10 cents or so. That will give you, so that extra 22 cents you can use in education in other areas. Okay? Now, a lot of discussion has gone into that issue of debt. 2 years ago, I did some work with the United Nations, the office in Trinidad. They were trying to see, because of our vulnerability in the Caribbean, I talked about the climate change issues and hurricanes. They were trying to see, can we make a link? Since all of the Caribbean countries are vulnerable
to natural disasters and climate change. And climate change is a big issue. Can we access resources that are available for climate change, but apply those resources to our debt? So my assignment was to come up with some idea as to how that can be done. Okay, how can we get that debt reduction and the climate change? So the proposal that I put forward, and they're working on, hopefully it will come through. The proposal was you have a kind of a debt swap, called a debt swap. Okay, so and the way it works is very simple. A country has to pay, let's say Dominica has to pay every year, they have to pay back $80 million in debt. Okay, we pay back $80 million to our creditors every year. Instead of paying back this $80 million every year, we strike a deal with our creditors. They allow us to use that money not to repay the debt, but to invest in climate change issues. So we use that money to build seawalls, to reduce our risk of landslides, to mitigate the impact of disasters, basically. Relocate villages and so on that are vulnerable, that kind of thing. So that money will go towards that. And it will be budgeted so that there is some control. Because governments are very funny. You give them a little chance, you say you're going to use it for that purpose, and then they use it for other reasons. Right? So it will have to be strictly controlled, and there will be constant reviews, so that if the government is not doing it, then they will have to now pay the debts, right? They will be removed from the program. So we have some kind of controls. So that was the proposal I was able to come up with after talking to the different countries in the region. And it's under consideration by everyone. But what I was able to show is that if you can reduce those levels of debt, the amount of income that will be available now to the country, always going towards climate change mitigation measures, but these are like infrastructure projects, these are like capital projects that can really help boost the country's economic growth. So there is a real growth impact that will impact growth, but also it will help the country to build up the resilience against natural disasters. So that's the kind of thinking that we have to come forward with, because other countries that are poorer, and although Dominica is by income levels, Dominica is a relatively poor country, but it is not considered to be a poor country by world standards. We are considered to be more or less like a middle income country by the definition used by the World Bank, which is the international definition. So countries like Haiti are considered to be a poor country. Guyana, interestingly enough, a few years ago was considered to be a poor country, and they actually benefited a lot from debt reduction programs that we did during the time I was in between the 1990s, 2000. We did a lot of debt reduction programs with countries around the world, and Guyana and Haiti were the two countries in the Caribbean that benefited from this, so that their debt levels went all the way down. They got significant debt forgiveness and so on. Okay? But because we are a middle-income country, we don't benefit. And interesting enough, Guyana is now swimming in oil. Guyana's growth rate last year was 43%, and they'll probably grow by 60% this year. Okay, because they now have the second highest reserves of oil in the world. All right, and that's why Maduro was getting so excited because all of this oil there, in the Essequibo, around the Essequibo area of Guyana. So these countries have to come up with our countries that are considered to be not poor countries. We cannot benefit. Not only are we not able to benefit from these huge debt reduction programs, we also cannot benefit from low interest rates. Okay, so for example, when Dominica goes to borrow, it usually borrows basically at near commercial rates. Whereas a poor country, defined as a poor country, can borrow at very concessionary rates. You're talking about rates of less than 1%. Okay? So if you compare 1%, say, on $100 million and 5 or 6 or 7 or 8% on $100 million, you can see how it makes a huge difference. Right? You're talking about significant sums of money, and the interest rate applied to that kind of increase your debt loads. And that's one of the reasons why, from that 80 million I spoke about earlier, more than 3/4 of that is in interest payments, and the rest is just principal. So it takes quite a long time to reduce that debt burden. And over time, you find yourself just going deeper and deeper in debt as a country. Right? So that is critical for us. Structural and fiscal reforms, that's another area that is critical if we want to confront those challenges. So Dominica, as we think of how we can reverse that serious slide that we have, that serious decline that we have, how can we do it? Okay, and you have to basically restructure your economy, basically. So I'm thinking, for example, that we need to put a lot of resources into agriculture. That would be one of my major recommendations, a lot of resources into agriculture, but not so much agriculture that we export our raw products. I find it extremely, even, well, not laughable, but almost idiotic that we send our plantains to Antigua, and Antigua are the ones sending out the chips to Sweden and to Europe. I mean, is there a boat that comes to Antigua that cannot come to Dominica? Probably there is. Right? Probably there is something that prevents us in Dominica from exporting our plantains at probably $1 a pound. And Antigua now enjoys that $8, $10 a pound.
And good plantain, eh?
Yes, good plantain there. All right, so I'll have to peek quickly at the screen there. Yeah, so it is the, right, so, yes, okay. So the two other critical areas there are the high level of foreign direct investment. There was a time when foreign direct investment was very much a part of it. So when, for example, Dominica did the Invest Dominica Authority, that was with the hope that businesses, you attract businesses, and as they come to Dominica, you offer them incentives, you give them tax holidays, you allow them to bring in their raw material duty-free and so on. You give them some space to operate so that they can then employ Dominicans and so on. But if you look at the FDI rates in Dominica lately, it's almost non-existent. We've not really been able to attract much foreign direct investment. And that's where our Dominican diaspora, when we talked about the diaspora last night, that's where I believe our Dominican diaspora can play a critical role. Okay, there are Dominicans with tremendous wealth out there, but probably by themselves they might not want to do something, but if you combine those resources as Dominicans, you can come back and do something in the country. So we have to think of how can we, that would be foreign direct investment because they're coming in with foreign currency, either Canadian dollars, coming with pounds, coming with US dollars, which is all good for us. Right? So how do we get more foreign direct investments into Dominica to confront what we see there? So that's an issue that we have to kind of roll our heads around. So if there are enterprising business persons about us, can we come up with a project, for example? A project, say that we are going to, we see every I'm taking a very basic example. I saw this one coming up the road. All those mangoes that go to waste every day in Dominica, every mango season. Can we come up with a project to dry this fruit? Not only mango, but probably to dry bananas and plantains and so on. Can we write up a nice project and then have this project as a Dominican, living in Dominica? You don't have the resources. Very little chance of you getting the money from the aid bank because they have not been, as I said, they have not really succeeded in living up to their mandate, because normally with that type of project, you'll be able to go to an aid bank to get resources. I know businesses in Dominica that have been struggling for years. I know, for example, and I see Passage and Billy Adrian there. I know the struggles that he's been through, trying to get his chips up and running. A project that you think that would be receiving funding from an aid bank, because it's a great project. It's making use of breadfruit, of plantains, of yams, and so on. I think that any government would want to support that, to have a program for those types of businesses to support it, but that does not exist. Okay? So a responsible government should be invested in those types of businesses. Because a small business like that can employ 10 people, but it can grow easily to 100 persons employed in that industry. Right? So that is something that certainly can be done and should be done in terms of getting those ideas going and then see how we can sell it to the diaspora. That's where we need to get a partnership with the Dominican diaspora, where they can group themselves into and see themselves now not only as I said sending barrels. Yeah, it's great to send a barrel into Dominica, but I think what is better is if we can use those resources for investment purposes. Right? And that can be done if it is organized, if there is some direction that is given from the authorities there. And certainly a much higher level of investment spending is required, and there must be a conversation as well. That is something and a responsible government can begin to. There must be a conversation with the commercial banking system. All right? You cannot have rates, for example, at 11, 14, 12%. When in the rest of the world you have interest rates at 2-3% where people can borrow from. Okay, so there must be some discussion that can be had with the commercial banking system to make it easier for people to source resources through that means. Right? So these are some of the ideas that we can look at. And of course, the idea of exchange rates is another big issue. How do we get exchange rates sorted out? Is a big one for us, right? And that is something you must have heard in the past. Some discussion about should we, for example, devalue the EC dollar. That's a conversation that we hear every now and then. Is our currency too highly valued? When you compare, for example, the Jamaican dollar is about 170 Jamaican dollars to one, and we are less than 2. Okay. Is a country like Dominica, should our exchange rates be a lot lower? Should we be offering 150 EC dollars to $1 US, for example? That's the discussion that we are over again, because it relates to competitiveness. Now, that discussion is really good if it is done like a country like Dominica, if you're competitive, if you have industry, if you have exports, if you have a buoyant tourism sector, those discussions become relevant for countries like Dominica, like our country. But in our current context, it is not. So, that is something that once you begin to develop a country, you have to start asking yourself whether or not, and there are ways you can determine whether or not your exchange rate is where it should be. All right, there is work that can be done in that. All right, and let me just conclude there with a few more facts on that. What we see is that economies are usually slow to recover. So when there is a hurricane, for example, it takes a number of years for the country to get back to that level it was before the hurricane. We saw it in 1979. We saw it again for a major hurricane in 2017. When it happens, natural disasters, it takes some time. We have to be honest, there is limited scope to diversify, but Dominica is in a very unique place, I believe, and we'll see as we go through the next 2 days. You will see the different opportunities in all of those sectors. Renewable energies, IT sectors. So we have some scope to think. We obviously need to strengthen our regional cooperation. By now, CARICOM should be more than just a political organization. There should be a lot more trade and industry and commerce going between the islands. So that needs to be strengthened, and we need to improve our competitiveness, obviously. And the final point there, that's the final point. All right. So let me just thank you for this. I hope I didn't take too much time, but it's important to kind of set the basis for this going forward. You will be hearing, we'll begin.